Welcome to PeopleTech, the podcast of WorkforceAI.news. My guest today is Matt Hillier, Cloudpay's Executive Vice President for Product. We're going to talk about how businesses can do more when they incorporate payroll into their strategic decision-making. We'll look at what's going on in the area, what should be going on, and whether HR makes enough use of AI and payroll data in the first place. Where's it all going? We'll see on this edition of PeopleTech. Hey, Matt, welcome. Now, there was a report from Everest Group not too long ago. 80% of companies can't use payroll to inform their business decisions. And practically speaking, what does that mean?
I think for a lot of organizations, we've got to remember payroll's coming from a position of largely being a transactional function. So it's been focused for a very long time on being very tactical, making sure that employees get paid on a day-by-day basis. But ultimately, that's really been a lot of the focus. And I think what we've seen in the last sort of 4 to 5 years, maybe started a little bit earlier than that, is a bit of a change in dynamic between organizations and their sort of payroll functions. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, been driven by a couple of things. Maybe 10 odd years ago, we started to see the rise of things like global payroll leaders. So very specifically starting to put leadership roles in that were looking after payroll, but then has been kind of emphasized and accelerated by a lot of the change in workforce. And so that's, things like remote working, that's things like legislation changes happening all over the globe on a number of things. And obviously, an environment where organizations are being asked to be more efficient, to be more specific, to be more data-driven in how they operate, how they engage with their staff, how they run their businesses. And so a lot of those pressures have been rolling down into payroll. That's created an environment, I think, where payroll leaders especially have been having to ask the question of, what information do I have to be able to strategically manage my payroll function? So not just looking at on a day-to-day basis, are people getting paid, but is that process of employees and workers getting paid functional? Is it accurate? Is it on time on a regular ongoing basis? And what are the things that I need as a leader in payroll to be confident that I'm able to manage an ever-growing portfolio of, organizations growing around the world, spreading globalization, and helping, HR and organizations to manage their talent.
You mentioned that payroll still is often regarded as tactical rather than strategic. I'm having some trouble picturing what strategic payroll looks like. How would an organization use payroll data to influence the business?
So we find, I think we find some really interesting ways that payroll is now getting engaged. That foundation of payroll, of being accurate, being on time, organizations are really starting to wake up to the fact that is a big part of driving employee satisfaction. It's kind of the beginning of the social contract between an organization and their employees. And so, I think as leaders are really looking at how payroll is integrated into their overall business, they're looking at it from an angle of how is payroll helping us to maintain and retain staff? How are our payroll organizations becoming more effective? They're growing with their organizations around the world, and in doing that, they're having to answer some of the same questions about scalability, about visibility into what's happening in their overall ecosystem. They're also having to answer questions around How can we support better remote working policies? How do we keep up with legislation and compliance? And so it's a lot of these angles that are now at the top of leadership minds that payroll now needs to have an opinion. Previously we would have thought of this as maybe sitting in the HR realm or sitting in the finance realm. And a lot of the information that those organizations sort of are now needing to absorb is now getting into that next level of detail. So let me blow up an example here. I've seen one example from an organization that started using their payroll data, to help inform their location strategy. So what they were doing was looking at where they had offices, where they were located, and obviously feeding in the normal things that you would expect around visas, ease of operations, setting up in a particular location. But what they were then farming from their payroll information was more insights about, well, what does it mean to operate into that in that jurisdiction? Where's the tax liabilities? But also then what would it mean for them for access for talent? And what does it cost to bring an employee in and to continue to pay someone in that environment? I think that particular example was looking at where they wanted to place their HQ, and they ultimately chose Thailand for many great reasons: culturally, socially, access to talent. But one of the key things that they identified through their payroll engagement was also that by putting themselves in the Thai market, they were also able to justify bringing in staff as expats, and the cost of bringing in individuals, paying for their relocation, looking at that kind of over a long-term period as a total cost of employment, and using that information to really identify that actually for them, in comparison to all of the other locations that they had access to, that gave them a much stronger value proposition. And so it's insights, and it's a lot more thinking now that I think goes on within the payroll realm, as again, organizations are really pushing down into their leadership teams to be able to contribute into how can an organization become more efficient, how can we retain staff and ensure that we get them not only in the door, but that they stay and that they're happy. Where are our employees located, both from an office perspective, but from a remote work perspective as well. And then how do we continue to navigate compliance and legislative challenges? And so there's this big universe now, I think, of factors that are showing up in the payroll space that only really payroll teams are equipped to answer. And this is putting those leaders now in a position where they are contributing more to their overall organizational strategy.
It sounds like this is about a layer of analysis being put over a payroll system's functionality, basically. So it does stuff and then it gives you what you need to think about it. Are most payroll companies, or are many payroll companies set up to do that? Or are they having to build whole new products or whole new utilities?
I think we're finding that a lot of organizations, a lot of vendors are having to build systems. One of the big challenges that we've seen, and we saw some of this coming out of the report as well, is there's still a lot of fragmentation in the way that payroll is implemented. So that looks like, for an organization, that looks like they may have 2, 3, 5, 15 different vendors working with them in a variety of geographies and in a variety of locations. And so, for them, that becomes very difficult, because then you don't have the consistency of information and insight that you can generate across your entire payroll estate. You don't have consistency in process. You don't have consistency in controls. And that's making it very challenging, I think, for leaders to really get a handle on what is going on globally in their organizations. At a local level, everything may look fine, but as you then imagine that payroll leader sat at a global level trying to understand what's going on in their ecosystem, they're obviously faced with all of those challenges. So, one of the key things I think that we're certainly seeing, and that, it's definitely kind of been a big driver in what's kind of kept me engaged in this problem for so long, is that there's a real need, I think, for payroll specific functionality. If we think about, where this started as payroll as a transactional tactical item, it was generally a bolt-on to maybe your ERP or your HCM platform. And that has served a really good, need, but that then hasn't allowed organizations to go beyond just simply the tactical.
Hi, this is Stacey Harris.
And this is Terry Zipper, and we're the host of the two podcasts under the HR Huddle.
On Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, we uncover the latest trends, truths, and challenges from Sapient Insight Group's groundbreaking research and our analyst insights, serving up everything you need to know about HR tech with no sugarcoating.
And on HR, we have a problem. We tackle the toughest workplace challenges head on, offering you expert advice and actionable solutions to help HR leaders thrive in today's fast-changing world. Whether you want the scoop on tech or tools to solve people problems, we've got you covered.
Take a listen and subscribe. If you want to become part of our community, we'd love to see you.
Hey, we're the Payroll Baddies, and our mission is to make payroll fun and relatable.
And call out industry when they hear it.
You got to call it out. You got to call it like you see it. But we also got to shine a light on all those unsung payroll heroes out there, making sure we get paid.
Yeah, those are the real payroll baddies out there, and we love sharing their stories and showing them love.
With gold chain and everything, baby.
By the way, SAP is the best payroll out there, and if you don't like it,
get out.
And so, I think that's created a very important environment where service providers and technologies have been coming along that have tried to look at that problem from a more holistic global perspective, and to think from the perspective of what does an organization need to understand about their environment, the unification of their overall payroll estate, how they can get control and how they can get insight into that overall ecosystem.
Can you give me an example of this? I mean, if you talk about payroll, or you say payroll to me, I understand it's about making sure each employee gets the amount of money they're due at the right time in a compliant way.
Yep.
Okay. So if you say using payroll to help answer strategic questions or give you a strategic idea of what's going on at the company, what's that look like? I mean, what kind of data point would people be looking for?
So I think there's we touched on a few of these a little bit earlier, but we see that organizations are, one, they're looking for, I'll call it performance. So they're looking at their internal efficiency of their overall payroll ecosystem. And if we break that down, a lot of organizations are starting to want to dive into their processes in a much more granular level. So let's imagine, a typical payroll cycle will include, collecting and inputting data and making sure that data is ready for calculating payroll. It will then move on to calculating results, making sure that we've got salaries and taxes. It'll then move on to paying employees and making sure that those the monies end up in the individual's accounts. Obviously, then paying on governments and tax bodies, and then ultimately returning all of that information back into the organization's ecosystem, and ensuring that entire process works and is consistent on a regular basis. So from an organization's perspective, a key thing that they're looking for and that they're driving now into is understanding where does that process work? Where do they perhaps have quality issues with data? Where do they perhaps have timeliness issues with getting information approved? And really allowing them to dive into that next level of detail so that they're able to continuously improve on their overall payroll organization. So that's really driving, I think, a lot of organizations into that space of being able to, as you kind of mentioned earlier, analyze, inspect, but also kind of it becomes a part of the continuous improvement engine that the organizations are really looking to leverage. I think, one of the other areas that we see a lot more conversation around is then also the way that employees get paid. So, we see around the world that there's a typical cyclical nature of how employees get paid. In some regions it's once a week, and employees end up with a paycheck in their bank every week. And a lot of places that's at a monthly level. And there's been a growing interest and momentum around organizations now trying to respond to the fact that workers are now looking for a lot more engagement and a lot more immediacy in their relationship with their employer. So that's been driving things like earned wage access, where, I've been working for 5 days. I now have an emergency, perhaps. I need to go and, get my car fixed. And I don't have access to the funds right now, but I know that I've already done that 5 days of work. Can I access that? And so as an employee, that's also helping organizations to start to provide more of a benefit that's very tied into their payroll to be able to access those funds and be able to provide that back to the employee in a much quicker way than they have been doing in the past. And again, that's then playing into their overall employment engagement strategy and how they're thinking about where does payroll and the impacts on those individuals really start to show up a different way of working than I think we've typically been looking at in the past.
So with AI continuing to sort of steamroll down the HR tech roadway, how do you see AI being used by the industry, the payroll industry? How are you thinking of using it? What advantages or tools does it bring to the table, assuming that it does in the first place?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things to kind of note from the payroll industry is that a lot of the conversation, I think, around AI is very much leaning into its potential. There's been imaginations have been stirred as individuals and as organizations have sort of seen the boom of the AI push across the world. So I think if I were to try and capture the main buckets that are showing up, I think firstly there's obviously this efficiency bucket. So that's talking to things like automating tasks. It's talking at kind of anomaly detection within payroll. How can we identify very easily that something isn't as we expected it? Perhaps there's a really big bonus going through, or somehow someone's salary on a month-by-month basis has changed. It's also playing into that scalability factor. So as organizations are trying to contain their costs and be more conscious on how many people they're hiring, obviously there's a really big link there with how can we continue to grow organizations without exponentially increasing the sort of payroll overhead. Also things like answering queries. So from an employee's perspective, one of the really interesting conversations that I've had is, organizations asking, well, hey, can we provide a way for an AI solution, for example, to help explain a pay stub to an employee It's not necessary. It's nothing. It's a thing that nobody gets trained how to do. You don't come out of college understanding how your pay stub is put together and the different elements on it. So it's really around looking at that from an efficiency perspective and from a scaling perspective. I think the second bucket is really into that insight and sort of intelligence area. So again, what are the trends going on in your payroll? Where are you increasing? Are you spending more money? Are taxes increasing at a rate that you weren't expecting in a particular geography? We've talked a little bit about kind of the strategic decision making from things like location perspective. One of the other areas, and I think one of the ones that I found has been really interesting for us, is that as we've been looking into the way that we're helping organizations to pay employees, so not just calculating payroll, but actually making sure that that payment is fulfilled. One of the opportunities in that space that we've been looking at applying AI has been helping organizations to understand when should they fund their payroll. So, that big movement of capital, what does that mean from a Forex perspective? And so from a timing, from a timing element, what is the right time for organizations to fund their payroll obligations? And then I think, the final category in there is I'll call them the moonshots. This is where the light bulbs have really turned on for payroll organizations. And some of the really interesting conversations in there, and I think we're probably a fair ways off from this at this point, has really been around, can we predict payroll? Can we, given a particular population in a particular geography with a certain set of characteristics, can we predict what payroll will look like next month in 12 months time, in 36 months time, so that organizations can have that level of detail at their fingertips to help them plan. But that's also, that question is also being applied to the lower level. Individuals are coming along and asking, if I enroll in this specific stock plan, for example, what would my taxes look like?
All of these capabilities, are they driving customers to sort of think of new solutions that they want? And at the same time, are they driving vendors, companies like Cloudpay, to look for better ways to leverage the technology? So is this being market driven, or is it being, supply driven? I guess is a way to ask.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think ultimately it's being market driven. I think the key thing I've kind of learned about payroll over my years has been accuracy is absolutely paramount. I think if we look at the one thing that the AI has done really well, it's allowed us to guess really quickly. But when you put it into a payroll context, you're suddenly asking for a very specific, accurate answer to a lot of questions. And so when we have, when we're looking at the sort of conversations that are going on in payroll from an AI perspective, I think it's largely being driven by organizations looking for help in these efficiency areas, and then B, I think a lot of the wish lists of things that payrollers especially would like to have done, but the technology hasn't caught up yet. So for example, all of that stuff around prediction and projection, for example, the really good example of I think customers and organizations have really been trying to find solutions to that for a long time, but the technology is just not there now. So I would say for me, it's very market driven. We're really looking from the perspective of what's really going to help an organization to continue to operate better and be a better partner to the business, rather than here's some cool tech and how can we apply it.
Matt, thanks very much for talking with me today. This has been fascinating, and I hope we can do it again.
Absolutely. It's been great being on today, and thank you for having me.
My guest today has been Matt Hillier, Cloudpay's Executive Vice President for Product. And this has been PeopleTech, the podcast of workforceai.news. We're also a part of the WorkFind podcast network. Find them at www.wrkdefined.com. And to keep up with AI technology and HR, subscribe to Workforce AI today. We're the most trusted source of news in the HR tech industry. Find us at www.workforceai.news. I'm Mark Pfeffer.